Welcome to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. This week we're starting the Biological Unit 1.1a, What is Evolutionary Psychology? So this is what most people think when they hear evolution. They think about Darwin and his book Origin of the Species, and they think about the chart being followed by monkeys. But in psychology, that's not what we mean. We mean the very first tribes, the dawn of human civilization, the early river civilizations from ancient history, and how we were villages and clans. And even with all our fancy tech and our gadgets today, we still react very much with the primitive side of our brain. We still think very much like our original ancestors in many ways that we'll go through very briefly here. So natural selection means that the only strong genes are the genes that will survive to be passed on to the next generation. So if your ancestors did not survive, then their character traits and their personality traits and their behavior also would not be passed on to the next generation. So the most adaptive traits, the traits that we adapt to, will be passed on to the next generation and so on. So any ancient man who tried to pet this tiger and turn this tiger into a house pet did not get to pass on his genes. That is what we mean. So when in these little tribal villages we would see somebody coming up over the hill, approaching our den, approaching our clan, approaching our village, we'd have to very quickly, instantaneously ask, are you friend? Are you enemy? Are you going to steal my food? Are you bringing disease? Are you bringing sickness to my people? Are you bringing war? Are you going to take my resources? Are you here to hurt me or help me? All of these things are what we would originally think of. So examples today of evolution that we still see, we still share phobias that we had in our ancestral days. For obvious reasons, before we knew how to fly, we had a fear of heights, obviously a fear of flying. We had a fear of snakes and spiders because they could be poisonous and they could cause us death. We also had a lot of fear of certain foods. Certain berries were poisonous or toxic, and we had to learn which ones would make us very sick. That is why today we see babies are very, very fussy when they first learn to eat certain meats, when they first learn to eat certain bitter vegetables. This little baby down here making that face. Also, pregnant women, part of why we believe that there's so much nausea in the first trimester was to make sure that pregnant women did not eat anything toxic. They didn't eat anything that would be poisonous during that time. So we've discussed this one already, but we know that our ancient genes, we had a taste for sweet and fat. We wanted the highest calories that we could get with protein in order to survive. And that's a problem now in modern day when we have so many calories everywhere we go. And the food companies know that, and they fill our favorite foods with sweets and fats because they know that that attracts us from an evolutionary perspective. Another example, who should I mate with? And who is most likely to keep my genetic code moving forward? And also our prenatal care of babies. And we'll go over a lot of this when we get to Valentine's Day. Other examples, genes seem to predispose us to species-typical behavior, and we mean human species-typical behavior. Specifically our emotions. We share surprise, we share disgust, we share aggression, we share jealousy, and so many others. Here's another couple examples where the evolutionary changes may have actually caused some of our modern behaviors and physical features that, we have deemed one way or the other. ADD and ADHD actually had an evolutionary advantage, and there's a lot of new research and books that are being written about this now. Being able to multitask may have actually helped us survive. It is a problem some days in our school, but it actually is there from an evolutionary advantage. Having curly hair actually helped to keep early humans cooled off, and it may have actually boosted our brain growth. Hernias and hiccups and why so many of us need to have our appendix removed. A lot of these issues actually stem from our evolutionary changes. The worst thing that could possibly happen to us from an evolutionary perspective is to be banished from the clan. That was absolutely the worst. And when we get into social psychology, we'll see why this really is so painful to us. It was very dangerous to survive outside of the tribe. That was where the fire was, and the fire kept us safe from the wild animals. It also kept us healed from the weather, protected from the weather, and protected from other tribes who might come and want to steal us away or make war with us. So there was a safety in numbers. There was a safety in being inside the tribe or the clan. It was especially dangerous for women and children. For a woman to be banished, she was really left out there helpless and defenseless against wolves and tigers and warring tribes and the weather. So we are social beings and we need to belong, and that is an evolutionary drive. Now, in the 1950s, there was an experiment in guided evolution. Dr. Dmitry Belyaev from Russia, he wanted to see how were dogs first domesticated by ancient man. So he said, could I do this with wild foxes? And foxes, if you don't know, they can be fearful, they're quite snappy. They are not domestic house pets normally. So he used 30 males and 100 females, and he mated the tamest of each generation after generation. He measured how well they would let you hand feed them, let you pet them, let you groom them. Did they have a snuggle response? All of these things that he measured. It took 30 generations. It took 40 years. It took 45,000 foxes until he eventually created a new breed of very docile, very eager to please domesticated foxes that can be compared to a small dog or a cat. They want human attention. They love to curl up with you. They will lick you like cats. Some can be litter box trained. So 40 years later, they are sold as house pets. They're quite expensive, but you can still get a domesticated fox as a house pet. We will see some videos of these in class. So he was trying to prove this argument of nature or nurture, which we're going to be discussing here in the biological perspective. He took the wild nature of the fox. The nature of the fox is to be afraid of humans. The nature of the fox is to attack humans if they're cornered or trapped. But he nurtured the better part of their nature over time until the fox was tame. So then we ask, can we do this with humans? And that leads us to a subject called eugenics, which is also a human form of directed evolution. So just like we might see breeding with livestock, breeding the very best racehorses, breeding the very best cattle, breeding the very best foxes, this was an idea that was around for a while about applying the principles of genetics in order to improve the human race. So we wanted to only breed the smartest, healthiest, it turned out to be often the richest couples that were allowed to breed. And this was first proposed by Francis Galton in the late 1800s. And he said, look, we've directed the evolution of animals and plants for hundreds of years, since ancient Egypt, really. Why can't we direct the evolution of humans? And why do we have to wait for natural selection, which takes, so long? Why can't we get in there and make our own choices? And these were the kind of ads that you would see advertised just before World War II. Only healthy seed should be sown, and they wanted to make sure only the fittest would be able to breed. Well, another interesting story from history has to do with eugenics. Juan Ponce de Leon, when he, of course, had the first Spanish expedition to Florida in the 1500s, he noticed the native Taino people. They were very tall, exceptionally healthy, very athletic, beautiful, beautiful people. And this is where he thought there was a fountain of youth in Florida. And of course, he went off on his adventures to try to find the fountain of youth, and he was not very good to the Taino people. But he didn't realize that these people actually practiced eugenics. Now, they didn't call it eugenics, but they bred the tallest men and the tallest women, and they gave the tallest men and the tallest women the most protein, really gave them a lot of luxury so that their children would also grow tall and strong. And they did this over time, over the generations, until what you had was an entire tribe that was stronger and healthier and tall and just beautiful people. And that's why he thought there must be a fountain of youth here somewhere. He didn't understand they were actually practicing eugenics. Now, eugenics has had a really bad history in the 20th century. It didn't go so well. If you've read The Handmaid's Tale, you can kind of read about where it's going. I think that's also a TV series now on Hulu. This idea didn't go so well. It was practiced throughout the 1920s to the 1940s. It was practiced all over Europe and in America. It was quite popular in America. They wanted only the fittest families for the country. But that meant that, again, only sometimes the wealthiest families or the highest IQ, the ones with the most college education, were allowed to breed. And they sterilized young women who they deemed as unworthy. The term was feeble-minded. This, unfortunately, was people who were multiracial, people who were gypsy, poor, uneducated, drug addicts, alcoholics, handicapped, people deemed as rebels or troublemakers. You could be sterilized at a very young age, teenage years even, and never be allowed to be a parent because you were deemed unfit, and only the fittest families could produce. This became the obsession, obviously, of the Nazi regime, where only Aryan women of the highest standings were encouraged to breed and breed as much as possible. But Jewish women were, of course, sterilized and then later sent to the camps and not permitted to breed. And I say breeding like it's livestock because that's how it was viewed. It's viewing people like we view horses and cattle and the foxes. Now, eugenics actually was practiced in North Carolina. Unfortunately, North Carolina had one of the worst forced sterilization programs in the entire United States. And we've had to make amends since the early 2000s. There are many books, many videos, many documentaries, many articles. Winston-Salem was up there with Raleigh and Charlotte up until the 1970s, so way past World War II, when we knew that this was a horrible program, when we knew that this was something terrible that was happening. It was still being practiced right here in good old Winston-Salem. And again, they were looking at the same groups of people that I already covered. Moving on to genetic mutations, sometimes a random error occurs in our genetic code. Sometimes it's an accident, sometimes it can harm us, sometimes it's there to protect us. So, for instance, the gene that produces sickle cell anemia is an adaptation to protect us against malaria. Malaria is a life-threatening disease. It causes extreme fever and flu. It's the bite of an infected mosquito that gets you really sick. So in areas where malaria was really prevalent, people would start to develop two copies of the gene as an adaptation to stop malaria, but it ends up leading to now something called sickle cell anemia. And people who were not raised in those areas and did not get exposure to malaria did not need this genetic mutation. Another genetic mutation that is frequently talked about, particularly on the AP test, is called PKU. And it's a genetic disorder that causes a liver enzyme deficiency. You can see on the right in the image all of the side effects: impaired brain development, intellectual disability, behavior problems, microencephaly, which can be an enlarged head, epilepsy, seizures. Now, you might not show any symptoms at all for the first few months of life, and then eventually these symptoms will start to emerge. So they saw that this could sometimes be linked with anxiety, depression, and phobias. Sometimes this even develops some of these behaviors in your 20s and 30s. So PKU is caused by a mutation. It can lead to cognitive disabilities and seizures. Again, it can lead to mental deficiencies. And now we're done with part 1. and we are ready for part 2, genetics.